So the way this is going to go is I'm going to give a brief introduction to the project as a whole, a few slides on that, and then and who we are. So we are Cecilia Dubé, who is from the University of Johannesburg. We're a little bit depleted today. Unfortunately, Cecilia had back surgery a few weeks ago and can't be here today, but she's here in spirit, and we draw strength from that. Sandy Kane, also from the University of Johannesburg, is here with us today. Allison Farrell also could not be with us for the presentation, though she will be able to join us a little bit later in the day or maybe tonight. She should be somewhere over the Atlantic right now. She's from the National University of Ireland at Binion. And I am Steve Salchek from George Washington University. So I'll give a brief overview of the project as a whole, just a couple minutes. And then we will bring on Allison to talk a little bit about what's going on at her institution. Then Sandy will speak. And then I will give my individual institution and wrap up with a little bit of the multi-institution data that we put together. So it's interesting. We're obviously, one of the interesting things about our group is we're from very different places, very different institutions around the globe. And so what binds us together? Because we've always been a tight group, pretty much from the beginning. We just always got along, it was really about, even though we're from very different institutions, we were bound by a shared project that was very strong for us. And I think that and certainly in my presentation, as I talk about the community, the learning community that we were able to form, that issue of having a shared project, I think, is a really, really big deal. And it certainly was for our group. So from the beginning, our shared interest in transfer centered around helping incoming university students transition into college and supporting their long-term learning and growth as writers across their university experience and beyond. So that was very important to all of us. And at the other institutions, particularly Johannesburg, these challenges are really quite staggering. So we were all trying to think about how we can use better understandings of transfer to make our institutions better and better serve the students. That was always, from the very beginning, our focus. So we had a very coherent shared goal, right, or focus, project, but we took a long time to get to know each other. We're from very different institutional locations. And so a lot of our questions were really quite descriptive. We just wanted to understand that pathway and how that pathway might be different or similar or different in different institutions, right? That's what's interesting about our group. So what do students bring with them, right, into this transition? And how variable is that across contexts? What are the expectations for writing when they arrive at university? And what are they expected to do? What do they do when they get there at these different institutions? How variable is that across contexts? What are the alignments and misalignments between the experiences that they're bringing with writing and what they are then expected to do at those institutions? And are those the same across institutions, right? That's one of the things we get at is that we talk about often college prep. You can say, you use that term often and it gets invoked in a kind of implicitly universal way. There's such a thing as being prepared for college, but is being prepared for entering into the Johannesburg system the same as, right? This is something that we're very much interrogating. So what are the broader institutional and national contexts of learning academic writing in English at each site? And we're not even going to go there today. They're very different. What are the most effective pedagogical interventions? And this is really, in many ways, the heart of what we're after, ultimately. In institutional structures for helping first-year writers make the transition from high school to college, writing and learning, and are those the same across institutions? So those are some of our basic questions. And some of the theoretical or core goals, kind of underlying concepts that we were working with or interrogating that emerged out of this was, first of all, to interrogate universal constructs of college preparation. Right? To really see, and Wenger talks about this the other day, there's very much multiple pathways through it. It isn't a single transition. It's a very varied process and shaped by all sorts of institutional and national contexts. And yet, colloquially, it's used as a kind of monolithic term, right? So explore underlying patterns, sort of in policy documents. Explore underlying patterns of similarity and difference related to processes of transition across contexts. And I think that's an interesting piece. We also, as a goal, we wanted to create a framework for aggregating and really sustaining data aggregation across contexts. That's something that we're trying to figure out how to do and sustain. And like a lot of presentations here this past day and today, explore the role of identity in the transition from high school to college, in particular the transition from student to emergent scholar. So we're focused on that particular, the writing identity and that particular social role, as opposed to the sort of categories of classmates and all that. So those are certainly part of it, but that's our analytical focus. So some of the shared data, and we didn't all do all of these things, but these were things that overlapped. So pre and post surveys, pre and post reflections, literacy narratives, and institutional data. And just one last interesting thing, I think one of the most interesting things about our partnership potentially was that the highly variable context of university writing presented in the study bring universal constructs of college preparation into question. So we really were working this tension of context, right? But at the same time, this variability provides an opportunity to look for underlying patterns across contexts that could contribute to a more generalizable theory of writing development and transfer. I mean, if you see similarities across institutions that are this different, this gives you some indication that maybe there is something underlying going on beyond context.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. Now I'm going to take you from Europe, from Ireland, across the world to my part of the world, to Africa, to South Africa. And as you know, South Africa is located at the very tip of the continent. The University of Johannesburg, where I am based, is located in Johannesburg, which is in pretty much the center of the country in Gauteng province. Johannesburg is considered to be the economic and business capital of South Africa. In fact, many people compare it to New York City, and I think that's probably quite an apt comparison. This is the University of Johannesburg. The University of Johannesburg is actually a very new institution. It came into being in 2005. At that time, in order to address the injustices of the past, the government was forcing several universities to merge with other universities. So UJ, as we call it, was forced to merge with 3 other previously disadvantaged institutions. And that then formed the new Comprehensive University of Johannesburg. Now, interestingly, one of the institutions that it had to merge with was Rand Afrikaans University, and this was a previous Afrikaner university and an all-white institution. So I arrived at UJ in 2004, which was 1 year before the merger of these institutions. So I actually have seen what it was like before, and then I've gone through that whole transformation process. That is still going on today. Things, I think, are going reasonably well at UJ, but it still has quite a few challenges with respect to merging 3 or 4 very, very different institutions with very different histories. It's a comprehensive university because it offers not only degree programs, but also vocational or technical diploma programs. It's a large institution. We have just under 50,000 students. About 42,000 are undergraduate students, 7,000 are postgraduate students. Of the undergraduate students, approximately 6,000 or 7,000 are what we call extended degree students. These are students that, well, we used to say that didn't meet the normal admissions requirements, so they were put into an extended degree program where they could do the normal 3-year degree program spread over 4. But now there are many, many more students who are not meeting the normal admissions requirements, but not all of them are placed in extended degree programs. In some ways, our institutions, or in many ways, our institutions are very, very different. But some of the things that Allison said in her presentation also resonated with me. and one of them was the issue of access and who actually goes to education. So I began my presentation by just thinking about this whole issue of the massification of education. And according to UNESCO, this is one of the defining characteristics of higher education in the 20th century. And it's very interesting to look at who goes to university and who doesn't go to university, and what the participation rates are in various countries. Worldwide, access to education to those groups previously denied access has really increased dramatically worldwide. Most of the increases have taken place in mid-level economic countries or high-income countries. The low-income countries are the ones that have tended to lag behind, and sub-Saharan Africa is right at the bottom of the list. So only 6% of students in that 18 to 25-year-old category are actually in higher education in that part of the world. South Africa, on the other hand, has a 16% rate, participation rate, and on the face of it, that looks quite good. But when you look at the economic level of South Africa, that's considered to be a low figure. It should actually be quite a bit higher. That figure also masks who goes to to university in South Africa and who doesn't. One of the recent figures that I saw was that 56% of 18 to 25-year-olds in South Africa, of white South Africans, go to university, but only 13% of black South Africans go to university. And then in terms of throughput rates and success rates, the figures are similar. Overall, well, actually they're even worse. Overall, the graduation rate is about 30%, and of that only 15% of black students actually graduate, who enter university actually graduate. So I think you can see that the challenges of higher education in South Africa really are quite daunting. Now these increasingly diverse student populations have given rise to a number of issues which do relate to preparedness for university. And in South Africa, one of them, and one that is frequently talked about, is what is called a lack of articulation between school, or high school in particular, and university. Students are not being prepared, especially in terms of reading literacy and math literacy, for the type of work and the expectations that are going to be placed upon them once they reach university. And many reports and many studies show that high school and the school system is really letting down South African students. For example, this Perlis report measures reading literacy. And back in 2008, when that report came out, South Africa placed at the very bottom of the list. And this is of all the countries that were surveyed. And this is despite the fact that they spend a larger part of their GDP on education than any other country in Africa, and yet they still place at the bottom of the list. Annual national assessment showed the same thing in 2011. They also focused on reading literacy, math literacy. The results are equally distressing. So everyone, it's part of the national debate, what to do about the educational system, how to better prepare our students so that they can succeed in higher education, and so that something can be done about the skills shortage in South Africa. So there have been many studies on general academic readiness for higher education, but not many people are focusing on what I've called, habits of mind or approaches to learning, and particularly writing, which also I feel relate to student success. So that's why, you know, all of the focus of our survey questions have been, you know, what knowledge, experiences, and dispositions towards writing do students bring with them to university, and how do they relate to general preparedness for university level work? And then hopefully what we learn from this study, we will be able then to put interventions in place that will help students to become more successful. So in our study, it was definitely a mixed methods approach. We used the same surveys. We adapted slightly to fit our context that Steve used at George Washington and Alison used at the National University of Ireland. We used standardized tests, in particular one called the National Benchmark Test, which measures academic proficiency for university level work. Our students also wrote literacy narratives, reflections. We used class marks, final marks, marks on writing assignments. But for the purpose of this presentation, there were one or two things that really stood out for us initially, and that's why Cecilia, my colleague, and I decided to focus on that one. And essentially, in a nutshell, what really blew us away was this feeling on the part of the students of being well prepared. So this feeling of being overconfident, feeling well prepared, and yet everything else, the national tests, their marks, show that they are grossly under prepared. So we were trying to figure out why there is this disconnect between the two. So the target group, two groups of first-year students at UJ on the Kingsway campus, which is the mother campus of the University of Johannesburg. These students were registered in academic literacies. They call them modules, but essentially they're just courses. So there were 470 students in the Faculty of Economic and Financial Sciences, and they formed part of the extended degree program, which I mentioned earlier. They were given 4 years to complete what mainstream students would take 3 years to complete. And that academic literacies course was called Language for the Economic Sciences. The other group were mainstream students in the Faculty of Law, and the academic literacy course was called English for Law, and there were 135 students in that group. So in terms of our data collection, we used the Daly-Miller test to test writing apprehension. We used the pre and post surveys that our cohort had developed. The institutional data that we looked at were the national benchmark tests. We also took a look at the first year experience survey to get an idea of where our students came from, and actually the majority of the students are, as you might expect, first generation students. We used semester writing assessment grades, end of year grades, literacy narratives, reflections, and so on. In addition, we also put together a short survey to just find out from the students' mainstream lecturers what types of writing assignments they gave to the students during the year, because anecdotally, we know that the students do not do much writing, but we wanted to see what they had to say about them. And because what really struck us was the strange disconnect between being overconfident and unprepared. This is why we decided to look at metacognition, social psychology, and theories of writing apprehension. Metacognition, you know, a lot of the presentations over the last day or two have focused on metacognition, and I also think this is extremely important and very, very relevant to the situation at UJ. The students really don't know what they know or what they don't know, and they don't have that ability to know what quality work looks like, what the appropriate standard to be aimed for looks like, so they don't even know how to make up the shortfall between their own work and the desired standard. As you all know, metacognition is seen to be very, very important for success in higher education. Students with well-developed metacognitive skills seem to do better than students who don't have good metacognitive skills. And the good news is it is something that can be taught, and most students can acquire metacognitive skills, but they do need to be taught. Social psychology, I think this probably really addresses that phenomenon that we're seeing of the students overestimating their own ability. And this isn't something that is unique to students. Social psychology tells us that people in general have a tendency to overestimate their own ability. Okay. So, but pertaining to...
Nobody here, though. We really are great.
But interestingly, as you probably know with students, it is the weakest students that tend to overestimate their ability the most. So that really resonated. I'm running a little bit out of time, so I'm going to speed up here. We were very interested in writing apprehension just to get a sense of how they were feeling as new students at UJ, and we frankly did expect, given that the majority of them did not meet the normal admissions requirements, would experience apprehension about their writing and about the expectations for writing. However, what we found was that the exact opposite was true. Only 2%, this is in the first week of the year, only 2% of the students said they had high levels of writing apprehension. Most of them fell in the normal range, but their score was, most of their scores were above the mean. So the trend was towards lower levels of writing apprehension. So actually that's very surprising, and we thought, well, surely by the end of the year, when they've had time to know what the expectations are, see what the writing requirements are, the apprehension would increase. In fact, it was exactly the opposite. They're even more confident. So in terms of the survey results, I'll just highlight a couple of things. Again, what popped out at us was that I am confident about my writing. When they entered UJ, 71.5% were confident, and at the end of the year, it was into the 80s. And the vast majority of students felt that they had been very well prepared for university, despite all these things I've told you about the school system that everyone acknowledges is a complete failure. So, again, very surprising. Another thing that we found very surprising was that exposure to writing was actually more limited in their first year at university than it had been in high school. And again, that also really, really stunned us. 78 or almost 79% of students had written at least 6 short essays in their last year of high school, compared to 33.7% at university. 19.7% had written longer essays in high school, compared to only 10.4% who had done so at university. Just to give you an idea of the context, though, In South Africa, at universities, class sizes are very, very large. And by large, I mean hundreds. There could be 300, 400, 800 students in a class. It's the lecture, the English lecture tutorial system. So the students have one lecture a week, and any further work might be done in tutorials, which is conducted by postgrad students. So the lecturers feel that they can't assign writing. They don't have the time. They're overworked. There's no time to mark writing. And they don't feel it's their job, it's not their responsibility, and they wouldn't know how to do it anyway. So this is where the lecturers are coming from. Motivation to write, as Allison pointed out in her group, most students are motivated by the grade. Students in high school were also motivated by a personal connection, but less so at university. And all right. Types of writing done in high school, mostly narratives, personal narratives, summaries, creative writing, a little bit of research. University writing, mainly summarizing, a little bit of analysis and evaluation, reading responses, more research. Interestingly, in high school, some students had used graphics or multimedia, but there was little evidence of this at university. And only 26% of students at university indicated that all or most assignments required them to observe discipline-specific conventions, while 39% reported they had done this in high school. So overall, the writing tasks in high school appeared to cover a wider variety of skills than at university. Do I have more time? A minute, okay. The NBTs, I'm not even going to get to my overall conclusion, but the NBTs assess the capacity of students to undertake university-level work, and you have to attain a certain score in order to be able to do that. At UJ, only 14.7% of the students admitted in 2012 achieved that threshold. Now, I have to say that the UJ has made a political decision to provide access to education to the children of the poor and the children of the working classes, and it's all about access and redress. But this is the nature now of the student body. In LES, only 11.4% of the students achieved that threshold. In EFL, the law academic literacies class, only 3.1% achieved that threshold. The marks on their writing assignment, these are average marks, 62% in the first, 61. In law, 51, 54%. End of year marks, these are 61, 55. So you can see why we were so stunned that they are so confident and they feel so well prepared. The survey, the lecturers say they don't give that much writing, and we know that anecdotally. So finally, much evidence that the students are not well prepared. I've talked about our expectations. One of the things that we concluded was that we feel that one of the reasons the students do feel confident and well prepared about their writing is the nature of the writing that they have been asked to do in the first year. There's very little of it, and what they are asked to do, they are able to do, or they are able to at least pass. And to many students, passing is good enough. So for them, they do feel prepared, or well prepared. So I'll leave it there. Over to you.
Yeah, and that was one of the interesting things about what constitutes preparedness. Does a D minus constitute preparedness? Because it kind of can, it kind of does. I mean, and this is one of the things that we've been kind of debating back and forth. I mean, and I might even, I'm almost tempted to just rifle. But some of the, if you look at when we do the comparable data at the end, and it's really strong. I mean, we would imagine that GW, I'm from George Washington University, and we'll get to it, is a very different institution, but the numbers really bear that out. And our students are doing a lot of writing, and when you really compare it, it's really quite striking. And so when I look at that issue of preparedness and expectation, in a way, my argument would be that they're kind of aligned. They weren't expected to do very much in high school, and they're expected to do even less in college. The alignment problem isn't between that. The alignment problem is between that and reality, right? I mean, so which speaks to a really profound dysfunctionality. I mean, again, it raises these interesting. There's a lot of different ways in which the concept of college preparedness can be unpacked and ways that kind of emerge that we're not expecting. So again, I'm going to give a little bit about my own individual project at George Washington. Very different kind of institution than the institution we just saw, right? Private institution, university, it's in downtown Washington. We're wedged in between the State Department and the White House, and we were like right there. Watergate is, I passed Watergate. Founded in 1824, that's about the size. The number to stick out is that it's $56,000 to go there every year. And it tells you something when your claim to fame is that you are no longer quite the most expensive university in the country. So again,
Number 3.
Yeah, we're number 3 now. So, juxtapose that with some of the things you just heard. I specifically teach within an even sort of strong, a very strong academic program within that. The Women's Leadership Program. It's an all-women, it's a first-year multidisciplinary learning and living program for women. There's 4 cohorts split out into about 20 each: science, health, and medicine, U.S. and international politics, globalization, economics, business, and international arts and culture. So it's a multidisciplinary program. The students in the program take about half their coursework in their first year in the program, so they take 3 courses together each semester. So they take a course in their field of study, like macroeconomics in the fall, and then they'll take an they'll take a humanities course, and they'll take a leadership seminar, right? And then in the spring, they take the next course in the sequence in their field of study. They take the writing required course. It's a writing intensive course, but it's all writing intensive. And they take another leadership seminar. It is an academically focused, highly selective, and highly motivated, and you can imagine the kinds of students at GW in some sort of ways. I mean, it's the nation's capital, and these are the cream of the crop. Right? We had admitted into our program a little over 80 students this next year. We almost had 700 applications. Right? So we're admitting a very small percentage. And one of the points I'll make at the end is, if this population struggles with the transition, right, that needs support. I mean, that whole notion of, there's a kind of idealized notion, I think, of college preparedness that if you're really prepared, there is no transition. It's just this seamless thing. And that's not true. If it doesn't work that way for this population, right, that's not how it works. So the piece of the study that I'll be presenting is trying to go after that question 5, which is, what are the most effective pedagogical interventions? So I created a pedagogical intervention that called the Women's Learning and Leadership Collaborative, and it's an example of a more generalized pedagogical approach that I've been working on for a while, which is designed to support transfer by transitioning first-year students into first-year colleagues. And this is what I mean. So it's a kind of an identity-based approach. So first-year writers, and first a couple of basic claims, assumptions that I think are borne out. First-year writers, and we'll probably all agree with, I think it was green-lighted in the thing last night. First-year writers who transition away from the paradigm of student-pleasing teacher, right? That kind of student mode, that identity, writing identity for a grade, and toward the paradigm of emergent scholar using writing as a tool to impact communities of shared interest. That transition will demonstrate greater gains in writing and learning over time. So that's one claim. As academic writers, first-year writers typically arrive at the university with the writing identity of student. That was one of my descriptive questions I wanted. Like, is that true? That's because I kind of work out that assumption, and it is true. A core goal of the first-year writing, therefore, is to transition first-year writers from first-year students into first-year colleagues. It's identity work. It's making that transition and the discursive practices and social practices that go along with it. So in this project, so this is the intervention, my classes, two WLP first-year writing courses were linked with two first-year writing courses at Asian University for Women in Chittagong, Bangladesh. So that university is located in Bangladesh. It's a regional women's-only university serving underserved women primarily from South and Southeast Asia. The project included women from countries such as Afghanistan, Vietnam, Pakistan, and India, as well as Bangladesh. So even though it's located there, it serves a regional population. And I have a lot of familiarity with Bangladesh, and this is how I got to know the university. My wife is Bangladeshi, and we go back and forth and very active in that community. Both sets of courses were taught as hybrids, right? And then the online space was the shared space, right? So through this shared space, the students work collaboratively to produce literacy narratives through a 3-stage process. So we managed to have this take about 8 or 9 weeks through the semester. Conducting extensive interviews, each one of these things took several weeks. So conducting extensive interviews with partners using a shared survey instrument, they Skyped, right, mostly. Participating in peer review groups to draft and revise literacy narratives, so they helped each other craft them as well as work on them in a variety of active ways. And reflecting on and sharing lessons learned by reading and responding to each other's work, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. And they also had a shared Facebook page. So the underlying theory that I'm trying to test to see if it does in fact get some of the learning outcomes that I'm after that I think will support transfer, it really has 3 design features. And we'll see, I'll provide samples of student reflections, and I'll be pointing out where I think this works, because I think there's a synergy between these things. And I think in the past, even myself, I did elements of these things well, but never put them together very well. But I think they all work really well when they're all together, which is immersion, structured reflection, and disciplinary content about writing. So immersion it provides an opportunity to take on the role of colleague, right? It actually constructs them in a real social space as colleagues, right? And a big part of that is to use writing as a tool for achieving some shared meaningful purpose. So that idea of having a shared project becomes really important for what I would really think of as an immersion experience. Structured reflection provides an opportunity to learn lessons, to actually mark that moment. So they have the experience. There's a quote by Eliot reading Pound. He said, I had the experience but missed the meaning. Right? And there's this kind of like, you have all these experiences, but really taking a moment to mark what did that mean and what do I want to carry with me, right? And disciplinary content about writing, and this is a theme that's come up in a lot of presentations, which is that it's not necessarily that productive just to say, go reflect. All right, insight. And it doesn't quite work. So there's ways in which we can support more productive reflection, and I would argue that one of the most important ways that we can support more productive reflection is by giving them some tools and disciplinary knowledge from writing studies in order to do that. And so that's really what this intervention is trying to put this theory into practice. And so a little bit about how I think it does that. So this intervention provides a meaningful opportunity for course participants to take on the identity of an emergent scholar by creating a social experience where these writers not only engage in a methodologically informed process of researching their own and the larger cohort's experience. So like we read a little bit about literacy narratives, and it's not just telling a story, it has some intent and focus. So it is a methodologically informed process, and it is very much seen as a kind of a research project, as well as a reflective one. But also use academic literacy practices to learn from and teach colleagues within a community of shared interests. Right, so they were explicitly told they're reading, they're teaching each other. That was sort of an explicit part. In the community of shared interest in this part, and I think that this partnership worked particularly well. The first one could conceivably be broadly applied. So the shared project is they're all first-year writers trying to figure out how to do, like, make it in college and make this transition academic writing, right? But in this case, and I think this is actually really important, is that because of the particular nature of the Women's Leadership Program at Asian University, they also had the shared mission of promoting women's education and leadership. This is something that they were committed to, right? So they really had a shared project. Just like our group, we come from very different places. We don't, how many times did Sandy have to explain what's going on in Johannesburg before I did that, right? So really different contexts, and in that way it's sort of tough to bridge, but you have this shared project that sort of brings you together. People are invested in making that bridge. And I think that was a big factor in immersion. So that's the immersion part. That's how I think that this intervention creates immersion. Additionally, because of the nature of the shared task, writing literacy narratives, this project provides, through structured reflection supported by disciplinary content, opportunities for the kinds of metacognition associated with improved transfer. So we're really trying to get them to mark the moment. So I looked at and coded 26 literacy narratives. The whole enterprise produced 54. It just worked out. There's just a couple extra students on their side, which is nice because we compare them very easily. In the reflection, and this will give us some sense of how it's immersive, and they were asked to write a one-page single-space analysis using the course readings to identify, discuss, and theorize patterns across the data set. And I referred to, so they were given about a quarter of them, and I referred to it as, you have now a data set. What do you see going on here? We've done some readings. Analyze that, right? They were also asked to select 3 narratives that spoke to them, right, in some specific way, and explain what they learned from it. And then finally, they were instructed to send the author of the narrative a note thanking them and letting them know what they learned from that author. And I didn't track that, but I know that it happened because people talked about it, because it was a kind of a big deal for them to have written something that somebody wrote them a long email about how it taught them, and really they connected to this, and they had this impact. And when you see some of the reflections, you'll see that there was a lot of impact. It was a very human connection, in fact. So I looked for these 5 codes: evidence of high levels of engagement, recognizing multiple pathways to literacy, growing self-awareness, explicitly recognizing writing as a social process, and this evidence. I'm really looking for evidence of moving from one paradigm to the other. And so what constitutes success? So in theory, I'm trying to think in terms of, well, is this a successful pedagogy? Is this a successful design? And rather than locating learning exclusively in the individual and evaluating the success of the pedagogical intervention, I was looking for evidence that the targeted learning outcomes were broadly distributed. So it's a distributed learning kind of idea. It's really what I was looking at. How broadly distributed were some of these learning outcomes? And really my hope is that they become social norms within these communities that are created by this project. And they were very high. So 96.1 of the reflections had at least one occurrence of, some high level of engagement. They loved this project. I mean, they just loved it, and they talked about it all the time. So I won't read that one, that's too thick. So now the student voices. One thing I liked about reading the literacy narratives was that I got to learn great lessons from some of the people that I lived with. It was like meeting their neighbor for the first time. It was something, and this was something nice about, and that phrase of people I live with and connecting with them on a deeper level comes up a lot. In addition to enjoying the individualized nature, so that's the enjoying of each narrative, I also enjoyed seeing the in-class concepts play out in real life. And here's an example of immersion. It's one thing to sort of read the stuff, but then they had this experience that because another thing about supporting reflection is they have something to reflect on. They have some powerful experience to reflect on, right? And so, here's a moment where you see that synergy. Ultimately, the narrative experience was rewarding and eye-opening. Reading all the literacy narratives produced by my fellow members, a rare and interesting experience. So isn't that heartwarming? That's nice. I guess I'm cynical. One of the things that was really interesting too is the way that it made them revisit stuff that they had read and maybe didn't connect to. So one of the things we do in our program is we have a summer reading program to kind of get the ball rolling. And we're a very privileged program, so we bring these authors in. So we have a small program. We brought her, Aziz, we brought her in to talk to our students at the beginning of the year. We brought her on that experience and how it changed because she knew this person now. Her paper really surprised me. In it, she talked about how she was one of 2 non-Muslim girls in an extremely Muslim elementary school. She even wrote about a time a girl got chastised for talking to a boy outside of school in a t-shirt and jeans. In regards to this experience, she even quoted a book that we read in class here, Zine Nafisi's Reading Lolita in Tehran. The fact that she could relate to this book that we both read in an entirely different, notion of difference again, in much more meaningful way really made an impression on me. While I read Nafisi's book, I had little to no experience myself where I could relate to being under any similar kind of oppression. Her sharing her story gave me a new and interesting point of view on the book, and because of this new perspective that I so thoroughly enjoyed her literacy narratives. Okay, so recognizing multiple pathways, I think this is important because in order to support transfer, and this is something, a message that we're hearing over and over, students have to understand writing is socially constituted. Because if it's universal, then there's no need to adapt what you learn in one space to another. It's not a question that you come up really. So, they have to understand writing is social. In understanding, I would argue, multiple pathways to literacy is one way to make the universal concept die, right? I mean, they start to realize different people have very different experiences. And one of the things about this as well is they started to realize that people had, one of the things that shocked, I was shocked by them being shocked. It was really striking, and privilege is so insulating, right? It was striking just how surprised they were to discover that their own experience wasn't everybody else's. Like this was catastrophically an event for them. Like it was a big deal. So importantly, so I have a couple of samples of this all over the place. Importantly, the shock not only supported normalizing their own experience and a greater appreciation for writing social, but also led to a lot of reflection on their own privilege. So 88.5% of the reflections had at least one occurrence of this code. And they're short, they're like a page. They're very dense coding. Sharing my experience with literacy with others while learning about this has taught me a lot about reading and writing in general. My interview with my partner in the first part of this project, I began to realize how different the experiences of the students at AU were from the experiences of my classmates at GW. There's different things going on here. And throughout the rest of the process, she also connects with sort of women's experiences with literacy here and abroad. This is one of my favorite ones. It was shocking to realize the struggle some other people went through in becoming literate. But it's a poignant line. I was aware of my own story's plainness, but kind of expected most to be like that, since I've always taken literacy as a given. It was surprising to realize just how it is for people in different cultures, the struggles they have to go through, and how they have to fight to achieve what is, for me, just in there. It's just there. One of the things books are just around. What's it like to not be able to just have a book? What's it like to have nobody else in your family to read? Let alone in the second language that you're going to school in, right? And it was interesting for me. I guess Carmen was telling me the story about the Queen of Versailles documentary. Apparently, there's a moment where the family the kids have to ride on a commercial jet because their private jet has been repossessed or something. And they're shocked. They're shocked that people do this. Flying from, what are these people doing on our plane? And so when you think about privilege like that, like, okay, I'm driving, this happens at GW. There's this thing, people, GW students, there's a subset that pay $2,000 that they love for champagne. And so there's that kind of conspicuousness. She's talking about privilege to read. They're starting to realize in the next one, my respect for non-native speakers has grown tremendously. Before this class, I'd never considered the difficulties they face. For me, learning a second language is an academic option. For people like her friend now, it can mean the difference between a lifetime of success or struggle. It's a necessary skill for survival. Really coming in contact with that kind of thing. And again, one of the things that really struck them, they really said, wow, how are they so good at English so quickly? Because they're interacting, it's an English medium And it's just very interesting, because they started talking, this came out in class all the time, they would talk about what a privilege it was to be able to speak in a language valued by other people, right? I'm speaking in that they're speaking in English, that's the language of the school. Like, they never thought, oh my God, that's a big deal. Never noticed it before. And again, the way that immersion works with the disciplinary reading, so they've had this experience, they've marked the moment in this way, and the next week we read Count Daraja. That would have been a very different experience of reading that book prior to this. And so this experience gave them something meaningful to think about, and a committed experience, because they became friends. A lot of them were still in contact. And so, but now the book expands the immersion experience because now they have a way of framing it within a larger historical and ideological context. And it's transformative. They see things in fundamentally different ways. All right, so I probably made that point. So we'll skip through some of these. I thought about how my own home life had a huge impact on my schoolwork, so there's a lot of this sort of thing. This is another one. Religion and culture were also a huge factor in most of the narratives. Like most, if not all of the narratives mention these factors playing key roles. Both are something that one thinks is the norm. Again, this rendering the invisible visible, and therefore never pays much attention to or realizes the impact. But after understanding the role that both played for other girls, I realized it had a huge impact on me as well. And this is a really beautiful one, so I'm going to read this one before skipping ahead a few. I love this one. And it's something that, it's funny because it just strikes me in your presentation about, and some of these issues of identity, it just, the students know that it's about identity, because that's what they talk about. Perhaps the biggest lesson that I learned from reading the narratives, a simple and rather cliche lesson, is that I am not alone. Oftentimes in reading these narratives, I felt as if these people were sharing very intimate and very vulnerable parts of themselves. I felt fortunate to be allowed to read them. These stories voice fears and apprehensions I have had, if not currently, at some time in my life so far. Reading the experiences of other people reminded me of my own experiences, memories that I hadn't recalled for years. Piecing these memories together and connecting them with more prominent memories helped me to see more clearly how I became the writer and reader I am today. All right, so a lot of them also came to realize writing is social. That number was 69%. There was also a lot of evidence of seeing writing embedded in community practices, right? There's a lot of growing evidence of that, which is important for the pedagogy. So when the act of reading and writing is grown within a community-driven space, it becomes something enjoyable. As individuals, reading and writing can provide an escape. As a community of scholars, reading and writing is an outlet to share ideas and an outlet in the collective human experience. Both social and personal, this process is unquestionably powerful for any narrator. We'll skip that one. All right, so, and the last one, I was looking for also direct evidence of them shifting paradigm, and I looked at a lot of different things seem to suggest this. So one of them was them moving to take a really long-term developmental view. They were no longer just searching for that grade right this week. And they were invoking a mastery versus performance mindset, and a very large percentage of them did that. They were explicitly demonstrating audience awareness. They were explicitly demonstrating a motivation of interest over grades. They were, the big thing is they had to be very explicit about it for me to count it. They were explicitly referencing the self or peers as colleagues or scholars. That was one of my favorites. They stopped calling each other fellow students. 20% of them were calling each other their colleagues. That was great. 30% of them used the word inspired. They were inspired by each other. And then I think one of the ones that I just glossed over, one of the ones I really liked, it wasn't just that they were learning. There were several ones where people were saying they had to now do something, right? Like, there was somebody who's like, I'm going to, I have to make Arabic part of my life. I have to do this. If they can do this, I can do it, right? They were really acting on some of this. And the numbers here, 96, only one of them didn't code for this. And so I was thinking, gee, that's a pretty high number. Maybe I want to double check that. Reflections with only one indicator were 27% about. Reflections with 2 or 3, and this is one page, it had with almost 35%. Reflections with 4 or more, they were talking about this a some of these things, again, just the last couple. This is my favorite one for us. This is how she started out. From various literacy narratives, I felt like I kept asking the same question. Why is the student-pleasing teacher paradigm so prevalent in high school? If high school was meant to prepare you for college, why are we stuck in this paradigm? Indeed. Here is an example of someone using one of the readings, right? Again, talking about this, and also maybe because they were also noticing that in their data set that there was clearly a shift towards this mastery language. And then I'll just really leave the last couple. To me, it seemed as if college was able to open our eyes to the idea of being an authoring community. It is apparent that by many of us writing about this paradigm, we've learned how important it is. We are all shifting from the student paradigm of studying and regurgitating knowledge to please a teacher to get an A to a colleague's paradigm. These are their readings of their data as well, which is nicely supported. We all share a desire to master the material so we can not only gain knowledge, but, and this is important for me, but also contribute to the conversation regarding topics we are passionate about, whether it's religion, politics, or some other field of interest. So they're clearly in that space. And this one I put just, it reminded very much of the opening plenary yesterday, right? I really love this piece because it acknowledged very specifically that becoming a lifelong learner is more than just books and assignments. It's discovering who you are as a person. And that seems to summarize the talk yesterday. So I took this pedagogical invention to be quite successful. What time are we? Here's some of the multi-institutional data. And we didn't do very many. I only have a couple slides on this. I knew we were going to be running long. But you know, what they bring, I have good news. 19-year-old college students everywhere are pretty confident. They are good. It's going to work out, you know? So that's sort of, you know, but what do we think about that, right? I mean, it raises certain issues. There's a sort of vague assumption that it's good to be confident, but that's not necessarily the case. It was also a little interesting in that, you know, the Irish feel confident but thinks that their schools failed them, whereas the other two, right? Like, what is that? Like, despite my terrible schools. And, you know, this one was also, you know, these are pretty mixed. Variable attitudes about writing themselves as writers, it's pretty different. I mean, I was happy to see my numbers moved so much, right? That's also evidence that the thing worked a little bit. And I don't really mind that they didn't enjoy writing too much more. I mean, right? It's not always great. But it is, you know, there is a high level of people. And here, I guess, one of the things that was interesting is that the Irish really enjoyed writing, but didn't see it as relevant. But the South Africans really didn't like writing, but they knew they had to do it. Motivated by grade. My reading of this is a little bit different. Yeah, they're motivated by grades more than interest, but the interest isn't that far behind, right? Even in high school, right? So the comment yesterday about, you know, they are finding things to be interested in. This is, I think, Allison's point about, look, they're bringing a lot of energy and they're bringing a lot of assets, and we're not necessarily doing much of that in some of these institutional contexts. And again, I was very happy with my numbers because I want to see the motivated by grade go down, which did a lot. I want to see motivated by interest go up. And so even though it started out real high, it got nearly universal. And then the motivated by impacting an audience went up a lot. So that experience of working in a community and really seeing yourself as a colleague within a community, I think there's some evidence that happened. And here's a big one. I mean, look at the difference between University of Johannesburg and my students. And I ended up looking at the numbers of papers that they're writing. Again, they were writing a ton in high school. They're writing even more in college. But they're not writing that much. That was one of the interesting findings because so the number goes up to 100%. But if you look at the average, they were writing 15 papers and 4 longer papers the last year of high school. Right? In college, it was just a little bit up. And so the last thing I'll leave you with is I was just thinking about, so what's the disconnect for my students? And again, thinking about really well-prepared students. Because it wasn't that they wrote a little bit more, but not much. And so I thought, well, is it the amount of writing was so similar, why did they struggle with the transition? were the types of writing different? And I looked at those questions. They weren't. They were writing the same stuff. Journaling, research papers, time grading, lab reports, literacy analysis. And then when I looked at the ways in which this is where there was a difference. And it's a little insidious because if you ask them, did you write a research paper in high school? They say yes. And you say, oh, we're going to write a research, but it's a very different research paper. And it occurred to me that the difference is the identity. So in high school, these writers were much more likely to see research as summarizing information or gathering facts, often in support of a pre-existing position, which I think that's what students do. That's a student practice. At universities, they were much more likely to experience research as inquiry. It's driven by audience needs, which I have a lot of evidence that they really were doing this. They also took a more active and critical posture towards sources. They used sources for greater variety of rhetorical purposes, like constructing a conversation or to enter into or as an interpretive lens with data. These are scholarly discursive in metacognitive practices. And so I think that the misalignment, at least for my students, was moving from a writer identity as student to emergent scholar, and that's what they struggled with. And again, it raises the final question of, if my students still need sustained support to manage the transition effectively, right, then that is something built